So 7.1, expanding U.S. influences. The objective for today is students will be able to explain the changing policies of the United States toward Latin American and Asian and Asia, and the growing influence of the United States in foreign markets. So the Spanish-American War was a war that the United States got involved in. The Spanish-American War actually took place in Cuba. Part of what was happening was Cuba was being treated unfairly by Spain, and so Cuba wanted their independence. The United States wanted to support Cuba, so they sent a ship called the USS Maine because American businessmen wanted to help. And this is important to know. You're going to see this theme come up a lot, is an economic interest in other countries was probably the driving force for imperialism. So the USS sent the Maine to help protect Americans. And then on February 15th of 1898, the Maine exploded, killing 260 sailors. So we don't really know why it exploded. We know that it exploded in the Cuban harbor. And this is a picture of it right down below. And this was really the beginning of what we call yellow journalism. And yellow journalism was this way of making stories sell. So they maybe would exaggerate a little bit or make things sound more dramatic than they were in an effort to sell more newspapers. This led Spain to declare war on the United States. And then the U.S. went to war with Spain. This was known as a splendid little war. It only lasted for 4 months. We had, in addition to fighting in Cuba, the Spanish Navy was also in the Philippines. So it lasted 4 months. Most of the fighting was in Cuba. However, we also saw some fighting in the Philippines, right? Because the Spanish controlled the Philippines. And so the Spanish Navy would keep their ships there. Which allowed for easy access to the United States. And so therefore, the U.S. fought Spain in the Philippines in an effort to kick Spain out, but also in an effort to gain control over the Philippines. And we'll get to that a little bit later. What we have in this picture right here is Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a special group that went to Cuba to fight. This is them in San Juan Hill in Cuba. I also forgot to mention that the U.S. fought Spain in the Philippines, and then the U.S. took control of the Philippines. And they became a U.S. territory in 1898. The impact of the Spanish-American War was the United States actually annexed quite a few countries after this. So to annex means to add. So they added Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And they did this via imperialism. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power, so in this case it would be the United States, and influence through diplomacy or military force. And in many of these cases, it was military force. Diplomacy means that the governments are working together. But in these cases, it was all used by force. So President Roosevelt became pretty popular after his fighting in the Spanish-American War and became president. He was our 26th president, as you can see by the picture in the bottom here. And one of his accomplishments as president was the Panama Canal. So part of the problem with the Panama Canal is the reason why they wanted it is they wanted Panama to shorten the distance around South America. So if we take a look, this is going to be a very terrible drawing, but if we take a look, we have North America, right? We have Mexico, and then it goes into Central America and eventually Panama before it gets a little bit bigger into South America. Okay. And so instead of having a boat travel all the way around, Roosevelt wanted to create a canal right here through Panama so that the boat, instead of going all the way around, could now go this way and get to California much quicker, and therefore reducing the cost that it would take to go all the way around the tip of South America. The problem is that at this point in time, Panama was not independent. They were controlled by Colombia. And so the United States had to encourage Panama to rebel against Colombia, which they did. Then the U.S. worked with Panama to create the Panama Canal. Now, something interesting about the Panama Canal was that it was actually really hard to build, not because structurally it was hard, but because malaria and typhoid fever and diseases. And so when Roosevelt sent people down to build it, they actually sent doctors with them to help ensure that everybody could stay healthy. So in addition to Panama, so this is President Roosevelt's foreign policy plans. We also had the open door policy. And the open door policy was actually a policy with China. To allow all nations to trade freely with China. And what was happening was at one point in time, only certain countries were allowed to change or to trade with China. And so the open door policy allowed everybody. But it did require them to obey Chinese law. And not everybody loved this idea. This actually led to the Boxer Rebellion. Where a group of political leaders were against foreign rule or foreign influence. Were against foreign influence. And rebelled against Americans. Now, the U.S. eventually stopped the rebellion and still had quite a bit of control or influence in China. All right, so the Roosevelt Colliery was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, if you remember, the Monroe Doctrine said that European affairs needed to stay out of Latin America. And essentially what it said is that the U.S. would aid any Latin American country. And he went on to extend this a little bit further with what we call the big stick policy. And this comes from a quote that he used to say, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Essentially, this was expanding what they called the police presence. In Latin America. And this is a great cartoon of this. We see what looks to be the king, the Monroe Doctrine right there. This is definitely Roosevelt on the U.S. ship. Here we have the Republic of Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo owed money to Europe, and so Europe was giving them a hard time, and the U.S. essentially told them to back off. Like, even if they owe you money, you still need to back off. And then this is just kind of the expansion of trade. So William Taft was our 30th president. And he essentially continued President Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy. He said, hey, yes, we'll protect Latin America, but we're also going to use it for our own interests. We see the U.S. steel, oil, and other investors here that he's essentially telling them, go ahead, go and invest, and we'll protect you with the U.S. military if we need to.